"You don't belong on this campus, boy. Move along before I make you move." Officer Chase Douglas sneered, his hand already reaching for the pepper spray canister on his belt. The black man in the navy blazer had been walking calmly across the university quad, briefcase in hand, when Douglas decided his presence was suspicious. What he didn't know was that Dr. Blake Ramsey wasn't just any professor. He was the FBI's leading behavioral analyst, someone who had spent years studying the exact type of prejudiced thinking that was about to destroy Douglas's career in the next 60 seconds. Which state do you live in? Have you ever seen someone's expertise become their shield when prejudice tried to break them? What happens when the hunter of criminal minds becomes the hunted? The autumn afternoon sun cast long shadows across Riverside University's main quad, where students moved between classes with the casual confidence of those who belonged. Dr. Blake Ramsey had walked this same path hundreds of times over the past 5 years, first as a visiting lecturer, then as an adjunct professor teaching criminal psychology. Today, he carried a leather briefcase containing the materials for his 3 p.m. seminar on behavioral patterns in law enforcement bias, a course that had become increasingly popular among both psychology and criminal justice students. At 38, Dr. Ramsey had built a reputation that extended far beyond the university's ivy-covered walls. His work with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had helped solve some of the Bureau's most challenging cases, from serial predators to domestic terrorists. His psychological profiles were considered among the most accurate in federal law enforcement, and his research on implicit bias in policing had been cited in congressional hearings. But to Officer Chase Douglas patrolling the campus on this Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Ramsey was simply another black man who didn't look like he belonged. Douglas had been with the Riverside Police Department for 8 years, and in that time, he'd developed what he considered an instinct for spotting trouble. That instinct told him that a black man in professional attire, walking purposefully across a predominantly white university campus, was worth investigating. The fact that Dr. Ramsey carried himself with quiet confidence, that his briefcase was expensive leather, that his navy blazer was perfectly tailored, none of these details registered as indicators of legitimacy to Douglas. They registered as pretense, as someone putting on airs above their station. "I said move along," Douglas repeated, his voice louder now, attracting the attention of passing students. Several slowed their pace, phones already emerging from pockets with the practiced ease of a generation raised on social media documentation. "This is a private campus. You got business here. You better have ID ready." Dr. Ramsey stopped walking and turned to face the officer with the measured calm of someone trained to de-escalate volatile situations. His psychological training kicked in automatically, reading Douglas's body language, vocal patterns, and positioning. Classic defensive aggression masking insecurity, with clear racial bias motivating the confrontation. Textbook case of what he'd been teaching about for years. "Good afternoon, officer," Dr. Ramsey said, his voice steady and professional. "I'm Dr. Blake Ramsey, psychology professor here at Riverside. I'm heading to teach my 3 p.m. class in Hartwell Hall." He reached slowly toward his blazer's inner pocket. "I have my faculty ID if you'd like to see it." But Douglas's hand was already moving, not to examine identification, but to unleash the pepper spray canister from his belt. "Don't reach for anything," he barked. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but Professor," he laughed, a sound devoid of humor, "right, and I'm the dean of students." The moment stretched taut as Dr. Ramsey recognized the escalation pattern unfolding before him. Douglas's pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow, his weight shifting to the balls of his feet, all physiological indicators of someone preparing for conflict. This wasn't going to end with a simple verification of identity. Douglas had already decided Dr. Ramsey was a threat, and confirmation bias would filter out any evidence to the contrary. "Officer Douglas," Dr. Ramsey said, reading the nameplate on the uniform, his voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "I understand you're doing your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. I teach here. Students in my 3 p.m. class are expecting me." "The only misunderstanding," Douglas snarled, "is you thinking you can walk around here like you own the place." His finger found the trigger mechanism on the pepper spray. "Last chance. Turn around and walk away, or I'll give you something to help you remember directions." Around them, the small crowd of students had grown larger. Cell phones were recording now, multiple angles capturing every word, every gesture. Dr. Ramsey was aware of the documentation happening, and part of his mind, the clinical part, trained in evidence collection, noted that whatever happened next would be preserved for analysis. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own assault might become a case study in the very course he was walking to teach. "Officer, please." Dr. Ramsey tried once more, his hands visible and open. "Let me show you my faculty identification. This can all be cleared up in 30 seconds. But Douglas was beyond listening. The black man's calm demeanor, his educated speech, his refusal to be intimidated, it all felt like defiance to someone whose worldview couldn't accommodate the reality standing before him. In Douglas's mind, this was exactly the kind of situation where authority needed to be asserted decisively. The pepper spray erupted from the canister in a concentrated stream that hit Dr. Ramsey directly in the face. The chemical agent struck like liquid fire, instantly flooding his eyes, nose, and throat with burning agony. Dr. Ramsey's hands flew to his face instinctively as he staggered backward, his briefcase hitting the ground with a sharp crack. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. His eyes clamped shut as tears streamed down his cheeks, his respiratory system rebelling against the chemical invasion. But even through the burning torment, Dr. Ramsey's analytical mind continued working. OC spray, he cataloged automatically. Oleoresin capsicum, designed to cause temporary incapacitation through pain compliance. Standard police-issued concentration, applied at close range without warning or provocation. Assault with a chemical weapon against an unarmed civilian on university property. "That's what happens when you don't listen," Douglas said, standing over Dr. Ramsey with unmistakable satisfaction. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to run game on a police officer." Dr. Ramsey dropped to one knee, still fighting to breathe through the chemical burn. His throat felt like it was closing, his lungs rejecting every attempt to draw air. Around him, he could hear students shouting, some in protest, others calling for help. The sounds seemed to come from underwater, distorted by the physiological chaos the pepper spray had unleashed in his system. "Oh my God, he just pepper sprayed a professor." A young woman's voice cut through the confusion. "That's Dr. Ramsey from the psychology department," another student called out. "He teaches my criminal justice class." "Someone call campus security. I'm recording this. This is insane." Douglas looked around at the growing crowd with irritation rather than concern. "Back up, all of you," he commanded. This individual was acting suspiciously and failed to comply with lawful orders. "The situation is under control." But Dr. Ramsey could hear something else in Douglas's voice now, a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. The officer was beginning to process the student's words, the repeated use of professor and Dr. Ramsey. Doubt was creeping in, but pride and the need to justify his actions were fighting against it. Through the burning haze, Dr. Ramsey managed to focus on his breathing, using techniques he'd learned in FBI crisis training. Slow, controlled inhales through the nose when possible, exhales through the mouth. Don't rub the eyes, don't panic. The chemical would run its course, but the situation was far from over. "Dr. Ramsey?" A new voice, older, authoritative. Campus security had arrived. "Sir, are you all right?" Officer James Mitchell, head of campus security, knelt beside Dr. Ramsey with the kind of urgency that comes from recognizing someone important was hurt. Mitchell had worked with Dr. Ramsey on several occasions when the professor consulted on campus safety protocols. He knew exactly who was writhing in pain on the quad. "Get me some water," Mitchell called to a student, and someone called the University Medical Center, now. Douglas watched this exchange with growing unease. The campus security officers' familiarity with the pepper spray victim was becoming impossible to ignore. The students' insistence that this was a professor, their use of Dr. Ramsey, it was all pointing toward a reality that Douglas's preconceptions had blinded him to. "What's your assessment of the situation, Officer Douglas?" Mitchell asked, his tone carefully neutral, but with an edge that suggested trouble brewing. Subject was acting suspiciously, refused to provide identification when requested, made threatening gestures, Douglas recited. falling back on standard report language. I used appropriate force to subdue a potential threat. Threatening gestures. Dr. Ramsey managed to rasp out, his voice hoarse from the chemical burn, but gaining strength. I was reaching for my faculty ID, which you refused to allow me to show you. The briefcase lay open where it had fallen, its contents scattered across the quad. Among the spilled papers, several items were clearly visible. A Riverside University faculty parking permit, several academic journals with Dr. Ramsey's name on the contributor lists, and most damning of all, a laminated faculty identification card with Dr. Ramsey's photo and title clearly displayed. Mitchell picked up the ID card and examined it, then looked at Douglas with an expression that could have frozen helium. Officer Douglas, you've just pepper sprayed Dr. Blake Ramsey, professor of psychology and criminal justice, consultant to our campus safety committee, and one of the most respected faculty members at this university. The color drained from Douglas's face as the full scope of his mistake began to register. But instead of acknowledging the error, his defensive instincts doubled down. How was I supposed to know? He should have identified himself immediately. He was being evasive. I attempted to show you my identification, Dr. Ramsey said, accepting a bottle of water from a student and carefully irrigating his eyes. You told me not to reach for anything. You decided I was a threat before you ever spoke to me, and nothing I said or did was going to change your mind. Around them, the crowd of student witnesses had grown to more than 30 people, most with phones recording every word. The documentation was comprehensive now. Multiple angles, clear audio, time-stamp verification. Whatever official report Douglas might file would have to contend with extensive contradictory evidence. Dr. Ramsey slowly got to his feet, still blinking away chemical tears, but regaining his composure with remarkable speed. His training in crisis situations was serving him well, allowing him to function through both the physical discomfort and the psychological trauma of unprovoked assault. Officer Douglas, Dr. Ramsey said, his voice gaining strength, you've just provided me with a perfect real-time case study for the class I was walking to teach. The psychology of implicit bias in law enforcement, the way preconceptions can override evidence, the escalation patterns that turn encounters into assaults. Douglas stared at him, pieces of the situation finally clicking into place. You're actually a professor? More than that, Dr. Ramsey replied, pulling his phone from his pocket. I'm Dr. Blake Ramsey, Supervisory Special Agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. I study criminal psychology and law enforcement bias for the federal government, and you've just given me the most detailed personal insight into both that I've ever experienced. The quad fell silent, except for the soft electronic sounds of multiple phones recording. Douglas stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. FBI, Behavioral Analysis Unit. The words hit him like physical blows. I need to make a phone call, Dr. Ramsey said calmly, speed dialing a number from memory. My unit chief needs to know that one of our supervisory agents has been assaulted by local law enforcement while attempting to fulfill teaching duties. Douglas watched in growing horror as Dr. Ramsey spoke quietly into his phone, providing what sounded like an official incident report to federal authorities. The officer's hands began to shake as the magnitude of his mistake crystallized. He hadn't just pepper sprayed a professor, he'd assaulted a federal agent, someone whose expertise would now be turned toward analyzing his every word, gesture, and decision. As Dr. Ramsey finished his call, and the crowd of students continued documenting the aftermath, one thing became crystal clear. In the span of 60 seconds, Chase Douglas had destroyed his own career by refusing to see the man standing in front of him as anything more than his prejudices would allow. The FBI was now involved. Federal charges were possible, and the entire incident had been recorded from multiple angles by dozens of witnesses. Dr. Ramsey looked at Douglas one final time before gathering his scattered papers and walking toward Hartwell Hall. His 3 p.m. class was waiting, and today's lesson on the psychology of bias had just been taught in the most visceral way possible. The encounter was over. The reckoning was just beginning. Dr. Blake Ramsey sat in the University Medical Center's examination room, 30 minutes after the assault, his eyes still red and watering from the pepper spray residue. The nurse had finished her evaluation. No permanent damage, though his vision would remain blurry for several more hours. But while his body recovered from the chemical attack, his mind was processing the encounter with the cold precision of a federal agent trained to analyze criminal behavior. He'd experienced textbook escalation patterns from Douglas, the kind he'd studied in dozens of cases, but never imagined he'd be subjected to personally. The officer's behavior matched every indicator of racially motivated policing that Dr. Ramsey had documented in his research. Now he was both victim and expert witness, living proof of the theories he'd spent years developing. As he waited for the campus police report, Dr. Ramsey's analytical mind began constructing the psychological profile that would eventually be used against Douglas in court. Defensive aggression masking deep-seated insecurity, racial prejudice manifesting as immediate threat assessment, authority complex requiring validation through dominance, classic patterns, textbook responses, predictable outcomes. The irony wasn't lost on him that Douglas had just handed him the perfect case study for his own research. The examination room was small and sterile, painted in the kind of institutional beige that was supposed to be calming, but somehow made everything feel more serious. Dr. Ramsey sat on the edge of the examination table, a cold compress held against his still burning eyes, while his mind worked through what had just happened with the methodical precision that had made him one of the FBI's most valuable behavioral analysts. In his 12 years with the Bureau, he'd interviewed serial killers, analyzed mass shooters, and profiled domestic terrorists. He'd sat across from some of the most dangerous minds in America and maintained clinical objectivity. But this was different. This time, he wasn't studying criminal behavior from the safety of a federal building. He was the victim of it. The chemical residue, still clinging to his skin, served as a constant reminder that all his expertise, all his federal credentials, all his professional accomplishments had meant nothing to Chase Douglas. In that moment on the quad, he'd been reduced to nothing more than the color of his skin, walking across a campus where someone decided he didn't belong. Dr. Ramsey pulled out a small digital recorder from his blazer pocket, a habit from years of documenting case observations. His voice was still hoarse, but his thoughts were crystal clear. Personal incident log, October 15th, 15:30 hours, he began, speaking in the clipped tones of official documentation. Subject, analysis of racially motivated assault by local law enforcement. Note, this represents the first time I've been both victim and analyzing agent in the same incident. He paused the recording and closed his eyes, allowing his mind to drift back through the encounter. Every gesture, every word, every micro-expression was filed away in his memory with photographic clarity. This was more than personal trauma now. It was evidence. The door opened, and Campus Security Chief Mitchell entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the expression of someone dealing with a public relations nightmare. Behind him was Dr. Sarah Chen, the university's Vice President of Academic Affairs, her face tight with concern and barely controlled anger. Dr. Ramsey, Dr. Chen said immediately, "I cannot begin to express how horrified I am by what happened to you today. The university will be conducting a full investigation and will be cooperating completely with any federal inquiry." "Appreciated," Dr. Ramsey replied, setting down the compress. "Though I suspect the federal inquiry is already underway. I spoke with my unit chief 20 minutes ago." Mitchell consulted his tablet. "We've collected witness statements from 17 students and faculty members who observed the incident. Every single account corroborates your version of events. Additionally, we have video footage from 6 different cell phones, plus our own campus security cameras." Dr. Ramsey nodded, his analytical mind cataloging the evidence. "The documentation will be crucial. Officer Douglas will likely claim he perceived threat indicators that justified his use of force. The video evidence will demonstrate otherwise." "You're remarkably calm about this," Dr. Chen observed. "Most people would be furious." "Oh, I am furious," Dr. Ramsey said quietly. "But fury doesn't help build a case. Analysis does. And right now, I'm analyzing the psychological profile of someone who just destroyed his own career through racial prejudice." He resumed the recording, speaking directly into the device. Subject profile. Officer Chase Douglas, approximately 35 years old, 8 years law enforcement experience, based on his own statements, exhibits classic markers of racial bias combined with authority complex, refused to process contradictory evidence when presented, escalated to chemical weapon deployment without provocation or justification. Dr. Chen and Mitchell exchanged glances. They were witnessing something unprecedented. A federal agent conducting a real-time psychological analysis of his own assault. The most telling aspect, Dr. Ramsey continued, both to the recorder and his audience, was his inability to recalibrate his threat assessment when presented with clear evidence contradicting his initial assumptions. Even when students repeatedly identified me as a professor, even when my faculty materials were visible, he couldn't adjust his perception. This suggests deeply ingrained prejudicial thinking, not situational bias. The distinction was important. Situational bias could be corrected through training, through exposure to different perspectives. Ingrained prejudice was systemic, requiring intervention at the institutional level. Dr. Ramsey's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed SSA Patricia Williams, his unit chief at Quantico. He answered immediately. Dr. Ramsey, came the crisp voice of his supervisor. I've just finished briefing the deputy director on your situation. The Bureau is treating this as an assault on a federal agent in the performance of official duties. Understood. I was conducting university business when the incident occurred, which technically qualifies as federal consultation work. Exactly. I'm dispatching a team from the Baltimore field office to take over the investigation. This is now a federal matter. How are you holding up? Dr. Ramsey glanced at Dr. Chen and Mitchell, who were listening intently. Physically fine, professionally fascinated. This is providing unprecedented insight into the behavioral patterns I've been studying. Only you would turn getting pepper sprayed into a research opportunity, Williams said, with dry humor. The team will be there within 2 hours. Document everything, not just for the case, but for your research. This could be valuable for the bias training program. After ending the call, Dr. Ramsey looked at his companions. The FBI is taking over the investigation. Officer Douglas's day is about to get significantly worse. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. I've worked with local police for 15 years. I've never seen anything this blatant. Usually there's some kind of gray area, some justification they can point to. But this, he shook his head. This was pure prejudice on display. Which is what makes it so valuable, Dr. Ramsey said, returning to his recorder. Most cases of racial bias in policing are subtle, deniable, hidden behind procedure and protocol. This was naked prejudice, captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by dozens of people. It's a perfect case study. He paused, remembering something from his past that suddenly felt relevant. 15 years earlier, FBI Academy, Quantico. The training scenario had been designed to test implicit bias in threat assessment. Dr. Ramsey, then Agent Ramsey, had been one of 20 recruits participating in a virtual reality exercise where they encountered various individuals in potentially threatening situations. The instructor, a grizzled veteran named Agent Harrison, had debriefed them afterward. Every single one of you, he'd said, took longer to identify actual threats when they didn't match your preconceptions. The white suburban dad with the concealed weapon, the elderly grandmother with explosive materials, the well-dressed businessman with the knife. But you also, Harrison had continued, his gaze settling on Dr. Ramsey, consistently identified threats that weren't there when the subject matched certain profiles. Young black males were perceived as more threatening even when exhibiting identical behavior to white subjects. Dr. Ramsey had raised his hand. So how do we counter that bias? Recognition first, Harrison had replied. You can't fix what you won't acknowledge. Then constant self-monitoring. Question your initial assumptions. Look for evidence that contradicts your first impression. And always remember that your badge doesn't make you immune to prejudice. It makes you more dangerous when you act on it. The lesson had shaped Dr. Ramsey's entire career. He dedicated himself to studying the psychology of bias, precisely because he'd experienced its power in that training room. He'd felt the pull of stereotypical thinking, the way fear could override analysis. Back in the medical center, Dr. Ramsey shared this memory with Dr. Chen and Mitchell. The tragedy of what happened today isn't just that Officer Douglas acted on his prejudices. It's that he had multiple opportunities to recognize and correct them, and he refused every single one. "You offered to show identification," Mitchell said, "multiple times, but he'd already decided I was a threat." Confirmation bias filtered out anything that contradicted that decision. It's a psychological phenomenon I've studied extensively, but experiencing it firsthand. Dr. Ramsey paused. "It's one thing to read about it in case files. It's another to have someone deploy chemical weapons against you because their prejudice won't allow them to see you as human." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "What happens now? From a federal perspective, I mean?" "Now the investigation begins in earnest," Dr. Ramsey replied. "The Baltimore field office will interview every witness, analyze every piece of video evidence, and conduct a comprehensive review of Officer Douglas's service record. If they find patterns of bias, and I suspect they will, this becomes much larger than just one incident." His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. "Dr. Ramsey, this is Special Agent Maria Santos from Baltimore. My team is en route. Please do not leave the campus until we arrive. We'll need your statement and evidence analysis." Dr. Ramsey showed the message to his companions. And so it begins. Officer Douglas thought he was dealing with a troublemaker on campus. Instead, he's just triggered a federal investigation that will likely expose systemic problems in his department. "You almost sound like you feel sorry for him," Dr. Chen observed. Dr. Ramsey considered this. "I feel sorry for what he represents. Douglas isn't an anomaly. He's a product of a system that allows racial bias to flourish unchecked. He'll face consequences, as he should. But unless we address the institutional factors that created him, there will be another Douglas and another after that." He stood up, his vision finally clear enough to function normally. That's why this case is so important. It's not just about one officer's misconduct. It's about holding up a mirror to show how prejudice operates in law enforcement. Mitchell's radio crackled to life. "Chief Mitchell, we have federal agents at the main gate requesting access to campus." "Let them through," Mitchell replied immediately. "Direct them to the medical center." Dr. Ramsey gathered his belongings, including the scattered papers from his briefcase that had been collected as evidence. "Officer Douglas wanted me to move along because I didn't belong on this campus. Instead, he's brought the full weight of federal law enforcement to investigate his department's practices." "Ironic," Dr. Chen said. "Inevitable," Dr. Ramsey corrected. "When you refuse to see people as individuals, when you let prejudice drive your actions, when you abuse the authority society has given you, there are consequences. Douglas is about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible." Through the medical center window, they could see 3 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot. Federal agents emerged, moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who took assaults on their colleagues very seriously. Dr. Ramsey smiled for the first time since the attack. Officer Douglas thought he was maintaining order by pepper spraying someone who didn't look like they belonged. Instead, he's about to discover that sometimes the person you're profiling has the professional expertise to profile you right back. The FBI had arrived. The real investigation was about to begin. And Dr. Blake Ramsey was ready to turn his most painful personal experience into the most important case study of his career. Special Agent Maria Santos arrived on campus with the kind of methodical precision that marked serious federal investigations. Within an hour of her team's arrival, they had commandeered a conference room in the University Administration Building and begun conducting interviews with every witness to the assault. But it was the institutional response from the Riverside Police Department that revealed just how deep the problems ran. Police Chief Robert Brennan's first instinct hadn't been to investigate the incident or discipline Officer Douglas. Instead, he'd called the university president to complain about federal overreach and suggested that Dr. Ramsey had been uncooperative during a routine security check. It was exactly the kind of response that transformed a single officer's misconduct into evidence of systemic corruption. Dr. Ramsey watched from the conference room as Agent Santos methodically documented not just the assault itself, but the institutional response that followed. Every defensive statement, every attempt to justify Douglas's actions, every failure to acknowledge obvious wrongdoing was being cataloged as evidence of deeper problems within the department. The system was protecting itself exactly as Dr. Ramsey had predicted it would, and in doing so, it was providing the FBI with everything they needed to dismantle it. The conference room buzzed with the quiet intensity of a federal investigation in progress. Agent Santos had transformed the space into a command center, with laptops displaying video footage from multiple angles, witness statements arranged in chronological order, and a timeline of events that painted a damning picture of institutional bias. Dr. Ramsey sat across from Santos, providing his formal statement while simultaneously analyzing the investigative process from his unique perspective as both victim and federal agent. It was a surreal experience, being interviewed about his own assault by colleagues who shared his training and understood the larger implications of what had occurred. "Let's go through Officer Douglas's statements one more time," Santos said, consulting her notes. "He claims you were acting suspiciously and failed to comply with lawful orders. Can you walk me through what specific behaviors he might have interpreted as suspicious?" Dr. Ramsey leaned back in his chair, his analytical mind engaging fully. "That's the key question, isn't it? What Douglas perceived as suspicious behavior was actually just my presence as a black man in a space he didn't think I belonged in, walking across campus with a briefcase, wearing professional attire, moving with confidence and purpose. Classic profiling," Santos observed. "Textbook case. But here's what makes it particularly egregious. When I attempted to de-escalate by offering identification, he interpreted that as resistance. When students identified me as a professor, he dismissed that information. When campus security confirmed my identity, he doubled down on his narrative. That's not just bias, that's willful ignorance." Santos made notes as Dr. Ramsey spoke. "We've seen this pattern before. Officers who refuse to acknowledge contradictory evidence because it threatens their initial threat assessment." "Exactly. And it gets worse." Dr. Ramsey pulled out his phone and accessed a recorded conversation. 30 minutes after pepper spraying me, Douglas called his supervisor to report the incident. "Want to hear how he described what happened?" Santos nodded, and Dr. Ramsey played the audio that campus security had provided under federal subpoena. Douglas's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Chief, I had to deploy OC spray on a subject who was acting suspiciously on the university campus. Individual claimed to be a professor but couldn't provide proper identification when requested. Used appropriate force to neutralize a potential threat." Santos raised an eyebrow. "Interesting interpretation of events. Note what he omits," Dr. Ramsey said. "No mention that I repeatedly offered to show identification. No acknowledgement that multiple witnesses confirmed my identity. No reference to the FBI credentials that were clearly visible once my briefcase spilled open. He's not just lying, he's constructed an alternate reality where his actions were justified." The door opened, and Agent James Rodriguez, Santos's partner, entered with a tablet displaying what appeared to be personnel records. "We've got Douglas's service file from the department. 14 excessive force complaints in 8 years, 9 involving minority suspects, 5 complaints specifically alleging racial bias." "Outcomes?" Santos asked. "All dismissed or marked unfounded. Internal Affairs cleared him every time." Rodriguez set the tablet on the table. "But here's the interesting part. 3 of those complainants were military veterans. 1 was a nurse, and 1 was a public school teacher, all respectable citizens with no criminal records." Dr. Ramsey studied the records with growing recognition. Pattern of targeting educated minorities in professional situations. Douglas has a specific psychological profile. He's threatened by black individuals who challenge his assumptions about social hierarchy. Santos made more notes. "This supports a federal civil rights case. Pattern of behavior under color of law, targeting individuals based on race." "It gets better," Rodriguez continued. "The department's response to today's incident has been illuminating. Chief Brennan called the university president to complain about federal interference. His exact words were, 'Why are you letting the FBI harass our officers over some campus troublemaker?' The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The police chief had referred to a federal agent and university professor as a campus troublemaker without bothering to investigate the incident. Institutional corruption, Dr. Ramsey observed clinically. The chief's immediate response wasn't to determine if his officer acted appropriately. It was to protect the officer from accountability. That's systemic failure. Santos leaned forward. Dr. Ramsey, in your professional opinion, what are we looking at here in terms of department culture? Dr. Ramsey switched into full analyst mode, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when briefing federal prosecutors. We're looking at an organization that has normalized racial bias to the point where obviously inappropriate behavior is reflexively defended. Chief Brennan's response tells us this isn't Douglas's first problematic incident. It's just the first one that couldn't be buried through institutional protection. He stood and began pacing, his mind working through the psychological dynamics at play. Douglas felt comfortable deploying chemical weapons against an unarmed civilian because he knew his department would back him up. That level of confidence doesn't develop overnight. It comes from years of having misconduct excused and justified. Agent Rodriguez pulled up another screen on his tablet. We've requested Douglas's body camera footage from the past 2 years. Interestingly, his camera malfunctioned during 7 of the 14 excessive force incidents. Technical malfunctions or convenient malfunctions? Santos asked. Given the statistical probability, I'd say convenient. Either Douglas is exceptionally unlucky with technology, or he's learned to disable his camera when he plans to exceed his authority. Dr. Ramsey stopped pacing and looked at his FBI colleagues. You're building a federal civil rights case that goes beyond just my assault. This is about a pattern of constitutional violations enabled by institutional cover-up. That's exactly what we're building, Santos confirmed. Your incident was the catalyst, but it's revealed something much larger. A police department that systematically violates civil rights and protects officers who do so. The door opened again, and Dr. Chen entered with a grim expression. Agents, I thought you should know. We've had 7 more people come forward since word spread about the investigation. Faculty members, students, and campus visitors who had negative encounters with Officer Douglas over the past 3 years. Santos and Rodriguez exchanged glances. 7 additional witnesses? 7 additional victims, Dr. Chen corrected, all describing similar patterns of harassment, all involving minority individuals, all previously unreported because they assumed nothing would be done. Dr. Ramsey felt a familiar anger building, the kind that came from seeing systematic oppression documented in black and white. They didn't report because they knew the system would protect Douglas and blame them. Classic institutional gaslighting. One of the witnesses is particularly significant, Dr. Chen continued. Dr. Amanda Foster, a visiting professor from Howard University. She's a civil rights attorney who was harassed by Douglas 6 months ago when she came to campus for a lecture. She didn't report it because she knew exactly how these cases usually end. Dr. Ramsey finished. A prominent civil rights attorney stayed silent rather than face the futility of challenging police misconduct. That tells you everything about how broken this system is. Santos was already reaching for her phone. We need to interview Dr. Foster immediately. If a civil rights attorney felt she couldn't get justice through normal channels, that's evidence of systemic denial of constitutional rights. As Santos made arrangements for additional interviews, Dr. Ramsey found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they were uncovering. This wasn't just about Officer Douglas anymore. It was about an entire institutional structure designed to enable and protect misconduct. Agent Santos, he said, I want to formally request that the Bureau expand this investigation to include a comprehensive audit of the Riverside Police Department's practices. What we're seeing here isn't an isolated incident. It's evidence of institutional corruption. Already planned, Santos replied. The Civil Rights Division is sending a team next week to conduct a full pattern and practice investigation. Your assault opened the door, but what we've found in the past 6 hours suggests this department has been violating constitutional rights systematically. Rodriguez looked up from his tablet. We just received the video footage from all 6 student phones. Want to see how different Officer Douglas's version of events is from reality? They gathered around Rodriguez's laptop as he played a compilation of footage from multiple angles. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Ramsey calm and cooperative, Douglas aggressive and confrontational, the unprovoked pepper spray deployment, the scattered briefcase revealing FBI credentials that Douglas chose to ignore. He's going to claim he felt threatened, Dr. Ramsey observed. That's the standard defense in these cases. By a man standing 10 feet away with his hands visible, offering to show identification? Santos shook her head. No reasonable jury would buy that. The question isn't whether a jury would convict Douglas, Dr. Ramsey said. The question is whether this department has created a culture where officers feel entitled to assault citizens based on racial assumptions, knowing they'll be protected from consequences. Santos closed the laptop. Based on what we've seen so far, I'd say that's exactly what this department has created. Chief Brennan's response, the pattern of dismissed complaints, the convenient camera malfunctions, it all points to institutional enabling of misconduct. Dr. Ramsey's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Dr. Ramsey, this is Dr. Foster. I heard about your incident and the FBI investigation. I'm ready to tell my story about what Douglas did to me. It's time this stopped. He showed the message to Santos and Rodriguez. And there's your pattern evidence. Dr. Foster stayed silent for 6 months, but seeing federal agents take this seriously has given her the confidence to come forward. That's how these cases break open, Santos said. One victim finds the courage to speak out, and suddenly others realize they're not alone. As the afternoon wore on, the conference room filled with statements, evidence and testimony that painted a damning picture of systematic civil rights violations. What had started as one officer's assault on one federal agent had revealed an institutional culture of racism and cover-up that reached the highest levels of the department. Dr. Ramsey watched Santos and Rodriguez work with professional admiration. They weren't just investigating a crime. They were methodically dismantling a corrupt system that had operated with impunity for years. Officer Douglas thought he could pepper spray me and walk away, Dr. Ramsey observed as the team prepared to conclude the day's work. Instead, he's triggered a federal investigation that's going to expose every dirty secret his department has been hiding. Santos packed up her files. Sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime. In this case, the institutional response to your assault has been more damaging to the department than the assault itself. Poetic justice, Rodriguez added. Douglas's prejudice didn't just destroy his own career. It's going to bring down the entire corrupt system that enabled him. As the FBI team prepared to leave, Dr. Ramsey felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The system had responded exactly as he'd predicted it would, with defensiveness, denial, and institutional protection of misconduct. And in doing so, it had provided federal investigators with everything they needed to hold it accountable. Chase Douglas had pepper sprayed a federal agent because his prejudice wouldn't let him see past the color of his victim's skin. Now that same prejudice was about to expose the institutional racism that had protected him for 8 years. The reckoning was accelerating, and there would be no hiding from the consequences. The morning news cycle erupted with the story that would dominate headlines for weeks. FBI agent pepper sprayed by police on university campus. By 6 a.m., every major network was running footage of the assault, and Dr. Blake Ramsey's credentials were being broadcast to millions of viewers. The narrative was impossible to spin. A decorated federal agent, teaching at a prestigious university, attacked without provocation by a local police officer with a history of complaints. Officer Chase Douglas woke up to find his life disintegrating in real time. His assault on Dr. Ramsey wasn't just local news anymore. It was a national scandal with federal implications, and as FBI agents knocked on his door with a warrant for his arrest, Douglas finally began to understand the magnitude of what his prejudice had cost him. But the investigation was revealing something far more disturbing than one officer's misconduct. The pattern of institutional protection, the systematic dismissal of complaints, the convenient camera malfunctions. It all pointed to a police department that had been violating constitutional rights for years while hiding behind badges and bureaucracy. Dr. Ramsey watched the morning news coverage from his office, analyzing the public response with the same clinical precision he brought to criminal cases. The story had everything needed for national attention: clear video evidence, an unsympathetic perpetrator, and a victim whose credentials made denial impossible. More importantly, it was opening conversations about police bias that had been suppressed for too long. The Riverside Police Department's headquarters buzzed with the nervous energy of an organization under siege. FBI agents had been conducting interviews since dawn, and every officer was wondering who would be called next. The federal presence wasn't subtle. 3 black SUVs parked outside sent a clear message that this wasn't a routine investigation. Chief Robert Brennan sat in his office, trying to control damage that was spiraling beyond his ability to contain. His phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke nationally. Reporters, city council members, and federal officials all demanding answers he didn't have. Worse, he was beginning to realize that protecting Douglas might have been the worst decision of his career. The knock on his door came at exactly 9 a.m. Agent Santos entered with Agent Rodriguez and a 3rd FBI agent Brennan didn't recognize, someone whose federal credentials and serious demeanor suggested this investigation had just escalated again. "Chief Brennan," Santos said formally, "this is Special Agent in Charge, Patricia Williams from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. She'll be leading the expanded investigation into your department's practices." Williams didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Chief, we need to discuss the institutional response to yesterday's incident and how it fits into a broader pattern of civil rights violations we've identified." Brennan felt his stomach drop. An expanded investigation meant they weren't just looking at Douglas. They were examining the entire department. "Agent Williams, I think there's been some misunderstanding. This was an isolated incident involving one officer who may have exercised poor judgment." "Poor judgment?" Williams opened a thick folder and spread photographs across Brennan's desk. "These are pictures from Dr. Ramsey's medical examination. Chemical burns to the eyes, respiratory irritation, skin inflammation. This wasn't poor judgment. This was assault with a chemical weapon against a federal agent." Brennan stared at the medical photographs, the visual evidence making Douglas's actions impossible to minimize. "I understand the incident was serious, but nothing," Williams interrupted. "Your officer deployed pepper spray against an unarmed civilian who was attempting to show identification. When confronted with evidence of his mistake, he doubled down on his false narrative. And when federal agents began investigating, your first response was to call the university and complain about overreach." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Brennan realized that his attempt to protect Douglas had been documented and was now being used as evidence of institutional corruption. Agent Santos consulted her notes. "Chief, in the past 8 years, your department has received 14 excessive force complaints against Officer Douglas. All were dismissed or marked unfounded. Can you explain this pattern?" "Internal Affairs investigated each complaint thoroughly," Brennan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, they didn't." Rodriguez placed a tablet on the desk, showing Internal Affairs files. Most investigations lasted less than 48 hours. No witness interviews beyond the officers involved. No examination of physical evidence. No review of camera footage, which was conveniently missing in 7 cases. Williams leaned forward. "Chief, what we're seeing isn't thorough investigation. It's systematic cover-up. Your department has been protecting an officer with a clear pattern of racially motivated misconduct." Brennan felt the walls closing in. Every decision he'd made to protect Douglas, every complaint he'd dismissed, every investigation he'd allowed to be rushed through, it was all being re-examined through the lens of federal civil rights law. "We've also discovered something else troubling," Santos added. "Officer Douglas's training records show he attended bias awareness training 3 times in the past 5 years. Yet his behavior yesterday demonstrated he either learned nothing from that training or chose to ignore it. This suggests the training was ineffective or that officers felt comfortable ignoring it," Williams observed. "Either way, It's evidence of institutional failure to address known problems. Meanwhile, at the university, Dr. Ramsey was conducting his own analysis of the expanding investigation. His FBI colleagues had shared enough information for him to understand the scope of what they were uncovering, and the picture was worse than even he had anticipated. Agent Santos called him with an update that confirmed his worst suspicions. "Dr. Ramsey, we've now identified 11 separate incidents involving Douglas over the past 3 years where minority citizens reported harassment or excessive force. None were properly investigated." 11 incidents. Dr. Ramsey felt his analytical detachment giving way to genuine anger. That's not a pattern. That's a systematic campaign of harassment, enabled by institutional protection. It gets worse. We found email exchanges between Chief Brennan and the Internal Affairs Supervisor discussing time problem complainants and strategies for discouraging formal complaints. They've been actively suppressing reports of misconduct. Dr. Ramsey absorbed this information with growing recognition of what they were dealing with. "Agent Santos, you're not just investigating Officer Douglas anymore. You're investigating a criminal conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." That's exactly what this has become. The Civil Rights Division is now treating this as a federal RICO case, a pattern of racketeering activity designed to systematically deny constitutional rights to minority citizens. The implications were staggering. What had started as one officer's assault on one federal agent had revealed an institutional conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the department. Dr. Ramsey's phone buzzed with another call. This one from Dr. Amanda Foster, the civil rights attorney who had been harassed by Douglas months earlier. "Dr. Ramsey." Dr. Foster's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I just finished giving my statement to the FBI. I want you to know that seeing your courage in coming forward gave me the strength to tell my story." "What happened to you should never have been covered up," Dr. Ramsey replied, "but I'm glad you're speaking out now. There's something else. I've been contacted by 6 other attorneys, all minority lawyers, who had encounters with the Riverside Police Department over the past 2 years. We're organizing to file a class action lawsuit alleging systematic civil rights violations." Dr. Ramsey felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The legal consequences were mounting just as quickly as the federal investigation was expanding. "Dr. Foster, the FBI would be very interested in hearing from those attorneys. Pattern evidence is crucial in federal civil rights cases." "Already arranged. We're meeting with Agent Williams tomorrow morning. This department's reign of terror is about to end." Back at police headquarters, Officer Douglas finally understood the severity of his situation. His union representative had just finished explaining that the department wouldn't be providing legal counsel for federal charges and that his personnel file was being turned over to federal prosecutors. "Chase," his representative said grimly, "you need to understand what you're facing. Assault on a federal agent, civil rights violations under color of law, conspiracy charges if they can prove the department was protecting you. We're talking about potential federal prison time." Douglas sat in stunned silence. 24 hours ago, he'd been a police officer with what he thought was justified authority to maintain order. Now he was looking at federal felony charges that could destroy his life. "How did this happen?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You pepper sprayed an FBI agent because you couldn't see past his skin color," the representative replied bluntly. "And then the department's response made everything worse by trying to cover it up instead of acknowledging the obvious wrongdoing." The door opened and Agent Rodriguez entered with another federal agent carrying an arrest warrant. "Officer Douglas, you're under arrest for assault on a federal agent, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deny civil rights under color of law." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Douglas finally grasped the full scope of his mistake. His prejudice hadn't just cost him his career. It had triggered a federal investigation that was bringing down the entire corrupt system that had protected him. "You have the right to remain silent," Rodriguez continued with the Miranda warning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Douglas, who had spent 8 years arresting others, was now experiencing the criminal justice system from the other side. And unlike his previous encounters with accountability, there would be no institutional protection this time. Dr. Ramsey received the news of Douglas's arrest while preparing for his evening criminal psychology class. The same class he'd been walking to teach when Douglas assaulted him. The symmetry was perfect. He would be teaching about criminal behavior while his own attacker was being processed through the system. As he gathered his materials, Dr. Ramsey reflected on how quickly the investigation had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. Douglas's assault had been like pulling a loose thread that unraveled an entire tapestry of institutional corruption. His phone rang one final time that day. Agent Williams with a comprehensive update. Dr. Ramsey, I wanted you to know that this investigation has now been designated as one of the Civil Rights Division's priority cases. We're not just prosecuting Douglas, we're seeking a federal consent decree that will place the entire Riverside Police Department under court supervision. Complete federal oversight. Complete restructuring. New leadership. Mandatory bias training. Civilian oversight. Body camera requirements. Independent investigation of all complaints. The works? Dr. Ramsey smiled for the first time since the assault. Officer Douglas thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he's placed his entire department under federal control. Poetic justice. Williams agreed. Sometimes the system's prejudice becomes so blatant that it exposes itself to the consequences it's been avoiding. As Dr. Ramsey walked across the same quad where he'd been assaulted less than 36 hours earlier, he realized that Douglas's attack had accomplished something that years of academic research and policy recommendations hadn't. It had forced the system to confront its own corruption in a way that couldn't be denied, dismissed, or covered up. The investigation was just beginning, but the outcome was already clear. A police department that had operated with impunity for years was about to face the full weight of federal justice. And it all started because one officer couldn't see past his prejudice long enough to recognize the man standing in front of him. When the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit learned that one of their own had been assaulted by local police, the response was swift and devastating. Dr. Blake Ramsey wasn't just any federal agent. He was one of the Bureau's most respected analysts, someone whose expertise had helped solve hundreds of cases. An attack on him was an attack on the entire federal law enforcement community, and that community was about to demonstrate why crossing the FBI was a career-ending mistake. Within 48 hours of the assault, Dr. Ramsey's professional network had mobilized with the efficiency of a military operation. Colleagues from Quantico, federal prosecutors who had worked with him on major cases, and law enforcement officials across the country were all demanding answers. The Riverside Police Department had picked a fight with someone whose professional reputation could bring federal resources they never knew existed. Officer Douglas had pepper sprayed what he thought was a troublesome civilian. Instead, he had declared war on the federal law enforcement establishment, and that war was about to be fought with resources, expertise, and institutional power that would crush everything in its path. The amateur was about to learn what happened when you attacked a professional. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico buzzed with controlled fury. In the main conference room, Unit Chief Patricia Williams addressed a gathering of agents who had worked with Dr. Ramsey over the past decade. The assault on their colleague had galvanized the entire unit in a way that surprised even Williams with its intensity. Blake Ramsey is one of our finest analysts, Williams began, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. His psychological profiles have been instrumental in solving some of our most challenging cases. Yesterday, he was assaulted by a local police officer who couldn't see past his own racial prejudice. Agent Michael Chen, who had partnered with Dr. Ramsey on 3 serial killer investigations, spoke up from the back of the room. What's the Bureau's official response? Complete federal takeover of the investigation, Williams replied. The Civil Rights Division is treating this as a priority case, and the director himself has authorized unlimited resources. We're not just going after the officer who assaulted Blake, we're dismantling the entire corrupt system that enabled him. Agent Sarah Martinez, a profiler who had trained under Dr. Ramsey, raised her hand. What about his research? Blake's work on police bias is groundbreaking. This assault proves everything he's been documenting about institutional racism in law enforcement. Williams nodded grimly. That's exactly why this case is so important. Blake didn't just study police bias academically. He experienced it personally. His assault provides perfect real-world validation of his research, and we're going to use that to push for nationwide police reform. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Dr. Ramsey's assault wasn't just a crime. It was evidence supporting his academic work on the very subject he'd been studying for years. Agent Rodriguez, who had been part of the initial investigation team, shared his findings. The Riverside Police Department's response has been textbook institutional protection of misconduct. They've given us everything we need to prove systematic civil rights violations. How many other cases have we identified? Williams asked. 17 confirmed incidents of bias-motivated harassment or excessive force by various officers in the department over the past 5 years, all dismissed or inadequately investigated. We're looking at a pattern that goes far beyond Officer Douglas. Williams stood and walked to a whiteboard covered with interconnected names and incidents. This isn't just about one officer's prejudice anymore. We're documenting a criminal conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of the department. Agent Chen studied the diagram. RICO charges already being prepared by the U.S. Attorney's Office. Conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, failure to intervene in constitutional violations. The works. The door opened, and FBI Director James Morrison entered, his presence immediately commanding the room's full attention. Morrison rarely visited individual units, and his appearance signaled that Dr. Ramsey's assault had attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. I want everyone to understand something, Morrison began without preamble. Dr. Ramsey's assault represents an attack on federal law enforcement itself. When local police assault FBI agents, they're challenging the authority of the federal government. We don't tolerate that challenge. He walked to the front of the room, his expression grave. I've spoken with the Attorney General. This case now has the full backing of the Department of Justice. We're not just seeking criminal convictions. We're pursuing a consent decree that will place the entire Riverside Police Department under federal oversight. Agent Martinez asked, "What about the officer who assaulted Dr. Ramsey?" Officer Douglas will face the full weight of federal prosecution. But more importantly, we're using his case to expose systematic problems that exist in police departments across the country. Blake's assault is going to become the catalyst for nationwide police reform. Meanwhile, at Georgetown University Law School, Dr. Amanda Foster was coordinating what had quickly become the largest civil rights action against a police department in recent memory. Her conference room was filled with attorneys, activists, and victims, all united by their experiences with the Riverside Police Department's discriminatory practices. Dr. Ramsey's courage in speaking out has opened the floodgates. Dr. Foster announced to the assembled group, "We now have 23 plaintiffs ready to file suit alleging systematic civil rights violations." Attorney Marcus Webb, who specialized in police misconduct cases, reviewed the evidence they had compiled. The pattern is overwhelming. Traffic stops based on race, excessive force during arrests, harassment of minority professionals. It's a textbook case of institutional racism. What makes this case unique, added Attorney Linda Rodriguez, is that we have an FBI agent as our lead plaintiff. Dr. Ramsey's credentials make it impossible for the defense to claim our clients were somehow responsible for their treatment. Dr. Foster nodded. Blake's assault provides perfect evidence of how this department operates. A decorated federal agent, teaching at a prestigious university, attacked without provocation simply because Officer Douglas couldn't see past his skin color. The assembled attorneys had worked on police misconduct cases for years, but none had seen evidence this compelling or systematic. The Riverside Police Department's institutional protection of misconduct had created a paper trail that documented constitutional violations with stunning clarity. The FBI investigation is providing us with evidence we could never have obtained on our own. Dr. Foster continued. Internal emails, training records, disciplinary files, everything needed to prove systematic denial of civil rights. Attorney Webb looked up from his files. What's our timeline for filing? Next week, we're coordinating with the federal prosecution to ensure our civil case supports their criminal charges. This is going to be the kind of comprehensive legal assault that destroys corrupt institutions. Back at Riverside University, Dr. Ramsey was experiencing something unprecedented in his academic career. His research was being validated in real time by his own personal experience. His assault had provided perfect evidence for every theory he'd developed about police bias, and academic institutions across the country were taking notice. Dr. Sarah Chen, the university's vice president of academic affairs, knocked on his office door with news that would change the trajectory of his career. "Blake," she said, "I've just finished a conference call with representatives from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. They're all requesting copies of your research on police bias, and several have indicated interest in having you join their faculty." Dr. Ramsey looked up from the stack of interview requests on his desk. "The assault has certainly raised the profile of my work. It's done more than that. Your experience has provided empirical validation of theories that were previously dismissed as academic speculation. You've become the most credible voice on police bias in the country." Dr. Ramsey's phone rang. Another interview request from a major news network. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate the opportunities, but right now my focus is on ensuring Officer Douglas and his enablers face appropriate consequences." "Of course, but you should know that the academic community is rallying behind you in ways I've never seen before. Your assault has become a rallying cry for police reform advocates nationwide." She placed a thick folder on his desk. "These are letters of support from criminology departments, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement reform groups across the country. Everyone wants to help ensure this case leads to meaningful change." Dr. Ramsey opened the folder and scanned the first few letters. The support was overwhelming. Colleagues he'd never met were offering resources, expertise, and testimony to support both the criminal prosecution and civil litigation. "There's something else," Dr. Chen added. "The university has decided to establish the Blake Ramsey Center for Police Accountability Research, full funding, dedicated staff, and a mandate to develop evidence-based police reform strategies." Dr. Ramsey sat back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what his assault had set in motion. "Dr. Chen, 48 hours ago I was pepper sprayed for walking across campus while blackface. Now I'm being offered positions at Ivy League schools, and the university is naming a research center after me. Sometimes it takes a dramatic incident to force institutions to confront problems they've been ignoring. Your assault couldn't be dismissed, denied, or covered up because of who you are and what you represent." Dr. Ramsey's computer chimed with an email from Agent Williams. The subject line read, "Federal Grand Jury Indictments, Officer Douglas and 3 department officials." He opened the email and read the details. Douglas faced federal charges for assault on a federal agent and civil rights violations. Chief Brennan was charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of justice. 2 internal affairs supervisors faced charges for systematically dismissing valid complaints. "The indictments came down," Dr. Ramsey announced. 4 officials facing federal charges, including the police chief. Dr. Chen smiled grimly. Officer Douglas thought he was dealing with some random troublemaker. Instead, he brought down his entire chain of command. "And that's just the beginning," Dr. Ramsey added, forwarding another email from the FBI. "The Civil Rights Division is announcing a comprehensive investigation of police departments in 12 cities. My assault has become the catalyst for a nationwide examination of police bias." That evening, Dr. Ramsey sat in his office, reviewing the day's developments. The professional networks he'd built over 15 years of federal service had mobilized with devastating efficiency. FBI colleagues were providing unlimited investigative resources. Academic institutions were offering platforms to amplify his research. Civil rights attorneys were building on his case to challenge systematic discrimination. Officer Douglas had attacked what he thought was an isolated individual. Instead, he had declared war on interconnected professional communities that possessed the resources, expertise, and institutional power to destroy everything he thought he was protecting. Dr. Ramsey's phone rang one final time, The caller ID showed Unit Chief Williams. "Blake," Williams said, "I wanted to give you an update on tomorrow's press conference. The director will be announcing the indictments, but he's also announcing something else, the Blake Ramsey Police Accountability Initiative." "What kind of initiative?" "Federal funding for research into police bias, mandatory training programs based on your work, and civilian oversight requirements for all departments receiving federal grants. Your assault is going to reshape how police departments across the country operate." Dr. Ramsey felt a sense of satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. "Patricia, Officer Douglas pepper sprayed me because he couldn't see past his prejudice. Now that prejudice is going to force changes that protect countless others from experiencing what I experienced." That's exactly right. Douglas thought he was asserting authority over someone he perceived as inferior. Instead, he's created a legacy of accountability that will outlast his career, his department, and probably his lifetime. As Dr. Ramsey prepared to leave his office, he reflected on the rapid transformation of his assault from personal trauma into institutional change. Professional networks that had taken years to build had mobilized in days to ensure that Douglas's prejudice would have consequences far beyond what anyone had imagined. The amateur had attacked the professional, and the professional community's response was about to reshape American policing forever. Officer Douglas was about to learn that some people you simply shouldn't attack, not because of their race, but because of their competence, connections, and ability to turn personal injustice into systematic reform. Dr. Blake Ramsey sat in the FBI's Baltimore field office, surrounded by case files that documented Officer Chase Douglas's 8-year career of systematic bias and abuse. But this wasn't just another consultation on criminal behavior. This was personal. For the first time in his professional life, Dr. Ramsey was creating a psychological profile of the man who had assaulted him, using his expertise as both victim and analyst to construct a comprehensive analysis of institutional racism in action. The irony was profound. Douglas had pepper-sprayed Dr. Ramsey because his prejudice couldn't process the reality of a black man with authority and expertise. Now that same expertise was being used to dissect Douglas's psychology with the clinical precision of a federal behavioral analyst. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was armed with a doctorate in criminal psychology. As Dr. Ramsey analyzed Douglas's pattern of behavior, a disturbing picture emerged, not just of individual prejudice, but of systematic conditioning that had taught Douglas to see certain citizens as inherently suspicious. The officer's assault wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable result of institutional racism that had been normalized, protected, and rewarded for years. This wasn't just a profile of one corrupt officer. This was an autopsy of a system that created monsters and called them heroes. The conference room at the FBI's Baltimore field office had been transformed into a behavioral analysis center, with whiteboards covered in timelines, photographs, and psychological assessments. Dr. Ramsey stood before the evidence wall like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, his analytical mind dissecting the career of the man who had attacked him. Special Agent Maria Santos watched with fascination as Dr. Ramsey worked. She had seen him profile serial killers and terrorists, but this was different. This time, the clinical detachment that made him so effective was layered with personal understanding of his subject's victims. "Let's start with the pattern," Dr. Ramsey began, pointing to a timeline that stretched across 8 years of Douglas's career. 14 excessive force complaints, 11 involving minority citizens, 9 specifically targeting educated professionals. This isn't random behavior, it's systematic targeting based on psychological triggers. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. What kind of triggers? Douglas exhibits classic symptoms of what we call authority displacement syndrome, Dr. Ramsey explained. Writing the term on the whiteboard, he's threatened by individuals who challenge his assumptions about social hierarchy. Black doctors, lawyers, professors, business owners, anyone whose success contradicts his racial prejudices. Santos studied the victim profiles they had compiled. All of Douglas's targets had professional credentials or educational achievements. Exactly. Douglas doesn't just harbor racial bias. He specifically targets successful minorities because their existence threatens his psychological need to maintain racial superiority. My assault fits this pattern perfectly. Dr. Ramsey moved to another section of the wall, displaying Douglas's training records. Look at this. Mandatory bias training every 18 months for 5 years, perfect attendance, passing grades on all assessments, yet his behavior never changed. So the training was ineffective? Rodriguez asked. Worse than ineffective, it was counterproductive. Douglas learned the language of bias awareness without internalizing its principles. He became skilled at hiding his prejudice, not eliminating it. Dr. Ramsey pulled up Douglas's written responses from bias training sessions. Read this evaluation from Officer Douglas demonstrates clear understanding of implicit bias concepts and commitment to fair policing practices. Written 3 months before he pepper sprayed a black nurse during a routine traffic stop. Santos shook her head. He was gaming the system. The system was designed to be gamed, Dr. Ramsey corrected. Superficial training that checked boxes without changing behavior. Douglas learned to say the right things while continuing to act on his prejudices. Moving to the psychological assessment section, Dr. Ramsey began outlining Douglas's mental profile with the precision of a medical diagnosis. Subject exhibits narcissistic personality traits combined with racial animus and authority fixation. Classic indicators include grandiose sense of entitlement, lack of empathy for victims, and need to dominate perceived inferiors. He circled specific incidents on the timeline. Notice the escalation pattern. Early complaints involved verbal harassment and minor physical contact. Over time, as Douglas realized he faced no consequences, the behavior became more extreme. Chemical weapons deployment represents the apex of this escalation. What changed? Santos asked. Why did he feel comfortable escalating to that level? Institutional protection. Dr. Ramsey replied immediately. Every dismissed complaint, every unfounded investigation, every administrative slap on the wrist taught Douglas that he was untouchable. The system's failure to hold him accountable became psychological permission to escalate. Dr. Ramsey opened a thick folder containing internal affairs records. Look at this pattern of departmental response. Complaint filed. Preliminary investigation lasting 24 to 48 hours. Finding of insufficient evidence or procedural compliance. The department wasn't investigating Douglas's behavior. They were providing him cover. Agent Rodriguez pulled up email correspondence between Douglas and his supervisors. These messages showed Douglas actually bragging about maintaining order and keeping troublemakers in line. He saw his bias as a feature, not a bug. Because the department rewarded it, Dr. Ramsey said grimly. Douglas received commendations for proactive policing and community engagement during the same periods when he was systematically harassing minority citizens. Santos examined the commendation records. He was literally being rewarded for the behavior that citizens were complaining about. Which brings us to the institutional psychology, Dr. Ramsey continued, moving to a new section of the analysis wall. Douglas didn't develop his prejudices in isolation. He was trained, encouraged, and protected by an organizational culture that shared his biases. He displayed a network diagram showing connections between Douglas and other department members. 14 officers had direct knowledge of Douglas's misconduct. None reported it. 3 supervisors actively participated in cover-ups. This isn't individual racism, it's institutional conspiracy. Dr. Ramsey's phone buzzed with a message from Agent Williams. Blake, the U.S. Attorney wants your profile for the grand jury presentation. Can you summarize the key points for federal prosecutors? Dr. Ramsey looked at his colleagues. They want the profile for the prosecution. Time to translate behavioral analysis into legal strategy. He moved to a clean whiteboard and began outlining the prosecutorial elements of Douglas's psychology. For federal charges, we need to demonstrate intent, pattern, and institutional enabling. Douglas's psychological profile provides all 3. Intent? Santos asked. Douglas's targeting of educated minorities shows deliberate selection based on racial characteristics. This wasn't accidental bias, it was intentional discrimination. Pattern. 14 incidents over 8 years. Escalating severity. Consistent victim profiles. Textbook pattern behavior that establishes systematic civil rights violations. Institutional enabling. Departmental protection of Douglas, despite clear evidence of misconduct, demonstrates conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. The institution became an accomplice to his crimes. Dr. Ramsey stepped back and surveyed the comprehensive analysis they had constructed. This profile doesn't just explain Douglas's behavior, it exposes the system that created him. Agent Rodriguez consulted his tablet. The defense will argue that Douglas acted within departmental guidelines and that any bias was unconscious rather than intentional. They can't make that argument with this evidence, Dr. Ramsey replied, pointing to specific incidents on the timeline. Douglas's pattern shows conscious decision-making, deliberate targeting, and calculated escalation. This wasn't unconscious bias, it was predatory behavior enabled by institutional racism. Santos pulled up the most damning piece of evidence, body camera footage from Douglas's encounter with Dr. Amanda Foster 6 months earlier. Watch this interaction. Douglas knew Dr. Foster was an attorney, yet he still chose to harass her. The footage showed Douglas approaching Dr. Foster outside the courthouse, demanding identification despite her clear professional attire and visible Bar Association credentials. His tone was dismissive, his questions designed to humiliate rather than investigate. This demonstrates conscious bias, Dr. Ramsey analyzed as they watched. Douglas saw a successful black woman and decided to assert dominance regardless of her obvious professional status. It's the same psychology that led to my assault. Agent Rodriguez paused the footage at a crucial moment. Look at his body language here. Shoulders back, chest out, finger pointing. Classic dominance display designed to intimidate someone he perceived as inferior. And notice Dr. Foster's response. Dr. Ramsey added, professional, courteous, compliant. Yet Douglas continued escalating because her competence and dignity threatened his need for psychological dominance. Santos reviewed her notes. This footage will be devastating in court. It shows Douglas engaging in the exact same pattern of behavior that led to your assault. Dr. Ramsey felt a cold satisfaction as he analyzed his attacker's psychology. Douglas's prejudice made him predictable. He couldn't see past racial stereotypes long enough to recognize actual threats or assess real situations. That psychological blindness is what led to his downfall. How so? Rodriguez asked. He pepper sprayed an FBI agent because his bias overrode his professional judgment. If he had been capable of seeing me as an individual rather than a racial stereotype, he would have processed the obvious indicators of my legitimacy: professional attire, university setting, faculty materials, cooperative behavior. Dr. Ramsey moved to the final section of his analysis, the long-term psychological implications of Douglas's behavior. This profile also predicts future behavior. Without intervention, Douglas would have continued escalating until he seriously injured or killed someone. The profile supports arguing for maximum sentences, Santos asked. The profile supports arguing for institutional restructuring, Dr. Ramsey corrected. Douglas is a product of systemic racism. Punishing him without addressing the system that created him just ensures there will be another Douglas. Agent Williams called to check on their progress. Dr. Ramsey put the call on speaker so his colleagues could hear the update. Blake, the grand jury has seen your preliminary profile, Williams reported. They're calling it the most comprehensive analysis of institutional racism they've ever reviewed. The foreman specifically mentioned how your victim's perspective combined with professional expertise created unprecedented insight. What's the prosecution timeline? Dr. Ramsey asked. Federal trial begins in 6 weeks. Your profile will be the centerpiece of the government's case. The U.S. Attorney is calling it the Douglas Analysis, a template for prosecuting systematic civil rights violations. Dr. Ramsey looked at the evidence wall that documented Douglas's career of misconduct. This profile began as my attempt to understand why I was assaulted. It's become a blueprint for dismantling institutional racism in law enforcement. Santos reviewed the final psychological assessment. Dr. Ramsey, You've created more than a criminal profile. You've documented how prejudice operates at the institutional level. That was always the goal, Dr. Ramsey replied. Douglas's assault on me was personal, but his pattern of behavior is systematic. The profile shows how individual bias becomes institutional corruption when left unchecked. As they prepared to conclude the analysis session, Dr. Ramsey reflected on the unique nature of what they had accomplished. He had used his expertise as an FBI behavioral analyst to profile the psychology of his own attacker, creating a comprehensive analysis that would be used to prosecute not just Douglas, but the entire system that had enabled him. Officer Douglas thought he was pepper spraying some random troublemaker, Dr. Ramsey observed, as he organized the final profile documents. Instead, he provided an FBI behavioral analyst with perfect source material for understanding institutional racism. Rodriguez packed up the evidence files. The irony is incredible. His prejudice against your expertise is exactly what gave you the tools to destroy him. And the system that created him, Santos added. This profile isn't just going to convict Douglas, it's going to be used as evidence in the federal consent decree that restructures the entire department. Dr. Ramsey looked one final time at the comprehensive analysis of Chase Douglas's psychology, behavior patterns, and institutional enabling. The profile was complete, documenting 8 years of systematic civil rights violations with clinical precision. The hunter had profiled his prey. The predator had been analyzed, categorized, and prepared for prosecution. And the system that had created the monster was about to face the consequences of its institutional racism. Officer Douglas had attacked someone whose expertise would be used to dissect his every psychological motivation. The amateur's prejudice was about to be destroyed by the professional's competence, one psychological insight at a time. The federal courthouse in Baltimore had seen many high-profile trials, but nothing quite like United States v. Douglas et al. The prosecution of 4 Riverside Police Department officials for systematic civil rights violations had drawn national attention, with Dr. Blake Ramsey scheduled to testify as both victim and expert witness. It was unprecedented for an FBI behavioral analyst to provide psychological testimony about his own assault, but everything about this case had shattered conventional boundaries. Officer Chase Douglas sat at the defendant's table, his police uniform replaced by an ill-fitting suit that couldn't disguise the fact that his world had collapsed completely. 6 weeks earlier, he had been a police officer with what he thought was legitimate authority. Now he faced federal felony charges, civil lawsuits, and the professional testimony of the man he had pepper sprayed in a moment of racist stupidity. As Dr. Ramsey entered the courtroom to testify, Douglas finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't just assaulted a random black man, he had attacked someone whose expertise would be used to expose every corrupt practice in his department. The victim had become the prosecutor, and the prosecution was about to be devastating. The reckoning had arrived, and there would be no institutional protection this time. The federal courtroom buzzed with controlled tension as Dr. Blake Ramsey approached the witness stand. U.S. Attorney Catherine Rodriguez had structured the prosecution around his unique dual role as victim and expert, and his testimony would serve as both personal account and professional analysis of systematic civil rights violations. District Judge Margaret Chen presided with the gravity appropriate for a case that would reshape federal law enforcement oversight. The defendants, Officer Douglas, Chief Brennan, and 2 internal affairs supervisors, sat with their attorneys, knowing that Dr. Ramsey's testimony could destroy any remaining hope of avoiding federal prison. Dr. Ramsey, Attorney Rodriguez began. Please state your qualifications for the record. Dr. Ramsey's voice was steady and professional. I am a supervisory special agent with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, holding a doctorate in criminal psychology from Georgetown University. I have 15 years of federal law enforcement experience and have provided expert testimony in over 200 criminal cases. And what is your area of expertise? Criminal behavior analysis, psychological profiling, and the study of bias in law enforcement decision-making. I have published extensively on racial profiling and institutional discrimination in policing. Rodriguez gestured to the defendants. Did you encounter any of these individuals on October 15th of this year? I encountered Officer Chase Douglas when he assaulted me with pepper spray on the Riverside University campus, where I teach criminal psychology. The courtroom remained silent as Dr. Ramsey recounted the assault with clinical precision, providing both victim testimony and behavioral analysis of Douglas's actions. He described the escalation pattern, the refusal to process contradictory evidence, and the institutional response that followed. Officer Douglas approached me while I was walking across campus to teach my 3 p.m. criminal psychology class. Dr. Ramsey testified. His first words were, "You don't belong on this campus, boy. Move along before I make you move." The language choice is significant. Using boy to address a black man is historically associated with racial subjugation. Rodriguez consulted her notes. What happened when you attempted to comply with his request? I explained that I was a professor at the university and offered to show my faculty identification. Douglas immediately became more aggressive, placing his hand on his pepper spray and stating that I was being evasive. When I reached slowly toward my blazer pocket to retrieve my ID, he deployed chemical weapons against me. Did Officer Douglas allow you to show identification before using pepper spray? No. He had already decided I was a threat based on my race and presence on campus. Evidence contradicting that assumption was filtered out through confirmation bias, a psychological phenomenon I've studied extensively in law enforcement settings. Dr. Ramsey continued his testimony with the dual perspective that made his account so powerful. As the pepper spray struck my face, I experienced two simultaneous reactions. As a victim, I felt the burning pain and respiratory distress typical of OC spray exposure. As a behavioral analyst, I recognized that Douglas was exhibiting textbook symptoms of racially motivated threat assessment. Can you explain what you mean by racially motivated threat assessment? Douglas perceived threat indicators that existed only in his prejudicial assumptions. My professional attire, confident walking style, and presence in an academic setting should have suggested legitimacy. Instead, they triggered defensive aggression because they contradicted his beliefs about racial hierarchy. Rodriguez moved to the institutional response. Dr. Ramsey, what was your impression of how the police department handled this incident? The department's response revealed systematic protection of misconduct. Chief Brennan called the university president within an hour to complain about federal interference, referring to me as a campus troublemaker without investigating what actually occurred. Did Chief Brennan attempt to determine if Officer Douglas had acted appropriately? No. His immediate response was to protect Douglas from accountability rather than determine if a federal agent had been assaulted. That response pattern suggests institutional normalization of constitutional violations. Attorney Rodriguez displayed the psychological profile Dr. Ramsey had created. Dr. Ramsey, is this your professional analysis of Officer Douglas's behavior patterns? Yes. This profile documents 14 incidents over 8 years where Douglas targeted educated minorities for harassment or excessive force. The pattern shows conscious bias, not unconscious prejudice. Douglas specifically selected victims whose success challenged his racial assumptions. Can you walk the jury through specific examples from this pattern? Dr. Ramsey turned to address the jury directly. In 2019, Douglas pepper sprayed Dr. Amanda Foster, a civil rights attorney, outside the courthouse after she had shown him her bar credentials. In 2020, he used excessive force against Marcus Thompson, a black engineer, during a traffic stop for alleged speeding. In 2021, he arrested Sarah Williams, a nurse, for obstruction when she questioned why he was detaining her teenage son. What's significant about these victim profiles? All were educated professionals with no criminal history. All were compliant during their encounters with Douglas. All were targeted precisely because their success contradicted Douglas's prejudicial worldview. I fit this victim profile perfectly. A federal agent and university professor attacked for walking across campus. Rodriguez continued building the systematic case. Dr. Ramsey, what does your analysis reveal about the institutional response to these incidents? Each complaint was dismissed or marked unfounded within 48 hours. No witness interviews were conducted beyond the officers involved. Physical evidence was ignored. Body camera footage was mysteriously unavailable in 7 cases. The department operated a protection system designed to shield officers from accountability. In your professional opinion, what does this pattern indicate? It indicates conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. This wasn't negligent oversight. It was deliberate institutional protection of criminal behavior. The department prioritized officer protection over constitutional compliance. Defense attorney Robert Kim rose for cross-examination. Knowing his strategy required discrediting Dr. Ramsey's credibility without appearing to attack a victim of assault. Dr. Ramsey, Kim began carefully, "Isn't it true that your personal involvement in this incident compromises your ability to provide objective analysis?" "My personal involvement provides unique insight that external analysis cannot achieve," Dr. Ramsey replied calmly. "I experienced Officer Douglas's psychology firsthand while simultaneously analyzing it with professional expertise. That combination creates unprecedented accuracy in behavioral assessment." Kim realized he was making Dr. Ramsey appear more credible, not less. "But surely your anger about being assaulted affects your professional judgment?" Dr. Ramsey's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Kim, I've interviewed serial killers who murdered children, terrorists who destroyed families, and predators who victimized the innocent. If I can maintain professional objectivity while analyzing those criminals, I can certainly maintain it while analyzing Officer Douglas." "Dr. Ramsey, isn't it possible that Officer Douglas simply made an honest mistake in threat assessment?" "No," Dr. Ramsey replied immediately. "Honest mistakes don't follow systematic patterns over 8 years. Honest mistakes don't ignore obvious contradictory evidence. Honest mistakes don't escalate to chemical weapons deployment against unarmed civilians offering identification." Kim tried a different approach. "But Officer Douglas had no way of knowing you were an FBI agent when he approached you." "Exactly," Dr. Ramsey said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when lecturing. "Officer Douglas saw a black man in professional attire and immediately assumed criminality. He didn't need to know I was FBI. He needed to see me as a human being deserving basic respect and constitutional protection." Kim's cross-examination was failing spectacularly. Every question designed to minimize Douglas's behavior only highlighted the systematic nature of his misconduct. "Dr. Ramsey, don't you think you're being too harsh in your analysis of what might have been a split-second decision under stress?" "Mr. Kim, Officer Douglas had multiple opportunities to de-escalate over several minutes of interaction. When I offered identification, when students confirmed my identity, when my faculty materials were visible after my briefcase fell. This wasn't a split-second decision. It was 8 years of unchecked prejudice culminating in assault on a federal agent." Kim attempted one final line of attack. "Dr. Ramsey, isn't your psychological profile of Officer Douglas based more on speculation than scientific analysis?" Dr. Ramsey smiled slightly. "Mr. Kim, psychological profiling is based on observable behavior patterns, documented incidents, and empirical analysis. I have 14 documented incidents, multiple witness statements, video evidence, and personal observation of Douglas's behavior. That's not speculation, that's comprehensive behavioral data. But you admit this analysis is unprecedented. Analyzing your own attacker? Yes, it's unprecedented, and that's exactly what makes it so valuable. I've provided both victim impact testimony and expert behavioral analysis. The jury gets to hear how bias operates from someone who experienced it personally while possessing the professional expertise to analyze it scientifically." Judge Chen intervened. "Mr. Kim, do you have questions about Dr. Ramsey's professional qualifications or the methodology of his analysis?" Kim realized his cross-examination was only strengthening the prosecution's case. "No further questions, Your Honor." Rodriguez resumed direct examination. "Dr. Ramsey, beyond your personal assault, what does your analysis reveal about the broader impact of the Riverside Police Department's practices?" The department's systematic protection of misconduct created a culture where constitutional violations were normalized. Officers like Douglas felt entitled to abuse citizens because they knew the institution would protect them from consequences. Can you quantify this broader impact? Our investigation identified 28 additional victims of constitutional violations by various department officers over 5 years. All were minorities. All complaints were dismissed or inadequately investigated. The department denied constitutional rights to dozens of citizens while protecting officers who violated their oaths. Rodriguez displayed internal communications between department officials. Dr. Ramsey, what do these emails reveal about institutional intent? Dr. Ramsey reviewed the documents projected on the courtroom screen. These emails show deliberate coordination to suppress complaints, discredit victims, and protect officers from accountability. Chief Brennan specifically instructed supervisors to find ways to dismiss complaints without investigation. Can you read this email from Chief Brennan, dated 6 months before your assault? Dr. Ramsey read aloud. We need to be more creative in handling problem complainants. These people think they can question police authority just because they have college degrees. Make sure the investigations conclude quickly and officers are cleared. The courtroom was silent as the implications sank in. Dr. Ramsey, what does this email indicate about Chief Brennan's mindset? It shows conscious bias against educated complainants and deliberate intent to deny them due process. Chief Brennan viewed citizen complaints as problems to be managed rather than constitutional violations to be investigated. The prosecution called its next witness, Dr. Amanda Foster, the civil rights attorney who had been harassed by Douglas months before Dr. Ramsey's assault. Her testimony corroborated the pattern analysis, describing identical behavior from Douglas despite her obvious professional credentials. Dr. Foster, Rodriguez asked, please describe your encounter with Officer Douglas. I was leaving the courthouse after a hearing when Douglas approached me aggressively. Despite my professional attire and visible Bar Association credentials, he demanded identification and questioned my right to be on courthouse property. When I showed him my attorney identification, he claimed it could be fake and continued harassing me. How did the encounter end? Douglas only backed down when a white colleague approached and vouched for my identity. Even then, he made it clear he considered my presence suspicious and would be watching me. The message was unmistakable. I didn't belong in spaces associated with legal authority. Why didn't you report this incident at the time? Because I knew exactly how these cases usually end, Dr. Foster replied. A black woman's complaint against a white police officer typically results in dismissed charges and retaliation. I stayed silent to protect my practice and my safety. What changed your mind about coming forward? Dr. Ramsey's courage. Seeing a federal agent speak out gave me hope that this time might be different. That maybe someone with his credentials could break through the wall of institutional protection that usually shields officers from accountability. The prosecution then called Agent Williams to testify about the FBI's investigation findings. Her testimony was devastating for the defense, documenting a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the department. Agent Williams, Rodriguez asked, what did your investigation reveal about the Riverside Police Department's practices? We found systematic patterns of civil rights violations, institutional cover-up of misconduct, and deliberate obstruction of federal oversight. This department operated as a criminal organization designed to deny constitutional rights to minority citizens while protecting officers who committed those violations. Can you be specific about the obstruction of federal oversight? Chief Brennan ordered the destruction of internal emails after learning of our investigation. He instructed officers to disable body cameras during what he called problematic encounters. He threatened department personnel with retaliation if they cooperated with federal investigators. These actions constitute obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Williams continued her testimony with clinical precision. We also discovered a pattern of falsified reports. Officers routinely filed false statements claiming suspects resisted arrest or appeared threatening when video evidence showed compliant behavior. Internal Affairs supervisors approved these false reports without investigation. Agent Williams, how many false reports did your investigation identify? 43 false or misleading reports over 3 years, all involving minority suspects, all designed to justify excessive force or harassment. The department systematically falsified documentation to cover up constitutional violations. Rodriguez displayed a chart showing the pattern of falsified reports. What does this pattern indicate about departmental intent? It indicates a criminal conspiracy to deny civil rights and obstruct justice. This wasn't individual misconduct. It was institutional policy designed to enable constitutional violations while avoiding accountability. The defense's case crumbled under the weight of evidence. Douglas's attorney attempted to argue that his client was following departmental training and culture, but this only reinforced the prosecution's conspiracy charges against his supervisors. Ladies and gentlemen, Douglas's attorney argued desperately, "My client was trained by this department. If his actions were wrong, it's because the institution failed to properly train him." This argument backfired spectacularly by confirming that the department had systematically trained officers to violate constitutional rights. Chief Brennan's attorney tried to claim ignorance of Douglas's misconduct, but internal emails showed explicit discussions of protecting problem officers from accountability. Chief Brennan didn't know about individual incidents. His attorney argued he was managing a large department and couldn't monitor every officer's actions. Rodriguez destroyed this defense during her cross-examination by showing that Brennan had personally reviewed and approved the dismissal of multiple complaints against Douglas. The internal affairs supervisor's attorneys argued they were following orders, but federal law doesn't recognize following orders as a defense for constitutional violations. "My clients were implementing policies set by their superiors," one attorney argued. "They can't be held responsible for systemic problems they didn't create." Rodriguez countered by demonstrating that the supervisors had actively participated in falsifying investigations and suppressing evidence, making them co-conspirators rather than mere subordinates. As the trial entered its final phase, Dr. Ramsey was recalled for closing testimony that would synthesize his victim impact statement with his professional analysis. "Dr. Ramsey," Rodriguez asked, "what impact has this assault had on your life and career?" "Personally, it's shown me that all my professional expertise, all my federal credentials, all my academic achievements meant nothing to Officer Douglas because he couldn't see past my skin color." That's a sobering reminder of how deeply racism still affects American society, even for those of us who study it professionally. And what impact has it had on your work? Professionally, it's provided unprecedented insight into how bias operates in law enforcement. My assault has become a case study in everything I've researched about institutional racism. The irony is that Douglas's prejudice has given me perfect evidence for the theories he attacked me for teaching. Rodriguez moved to her final question. "Dr. Ramsey, what does justice look like in this case?" Dr. Ramsey considered the question carefully. Justice requires accountability at every level. Officer Douglas must face consequences for his assault. Chief Brennan and his supervisors must face consequences for enabling systematic civil rights violations, and the institution must be restructured to prevent future violations. But beyond individual accountability, justice requires systemic change, federal oversight, civilian review, bias training that actually works, and cultural transformation that makes officers like Douglas impossible rather than inevitable. My assault was personal, but the solution must be institutional. The prosecution rested with Dr. Ramsey's testimony ringing through the courtroom. The defense had no effective response to victim testimony, backed by professional expertise and supported by overwhelming evidence of institutional corruption. During closing arguments, Attorney Rodriguez summarized the case with devastating simplicity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Dr. Ramsey was pepper sprayed for walking while black on a university campus. That assault revealed a police department that had normalized racism, protected misconduct, and systematically denied civil rights to minority citizens." She gestured to the defendants. These men didn't just violate Dr. Ramsey's rights. They conspired to violate the constitutional rights of every citizen their department was sworn to protect. Federal law exists to stop exactly this kind of institutional corruption. Rodriguez walked to the evidence display, showing the pattern of misconduct. Officer Douglas didn't act alone. He was enabled, protected, and encouraged by supervisors who viewed constitutional violations as acceptable policy. This conspiracy reached the highest levels of the department and must be stopped. The evidence shows deliberate intent to deny civil rights, systematic falsification of reports, obstruction of federal oversight, and retaliation against victims who sought justice. These aren't the actions of officers who made mistakes. These are the actions of criminals who happen to wear badges. The defense's closing arguments rang hollow against the mountain of evidence the prosecution had presented. Douglas's attorney claimed his client made an honest mistake, but 14 previous incidents made that argument laughable. Officer Douglas was doing his job as he was trained, the attorney argued. If that training was flawed, he shouldn't be held responsible for institutional failures. The argument fell flat because it confirmed that the institution had systematically trained officers to violate constitutional rights. Chief Brennan's attorney argued that federal oversight violated local autonomy, but constitutional rights aren't subject to local preferences. Federal interference in local policing undermines community safety, the attorney claimed. Chief Brennan was protecting his officers from federal overreach. Rodriguez had anticipated this argument and demolished it during rebuttal. Constitutional rights are not federal overreach. They are the foundation of American law. When local officials systematically violate those rights, federal intervention becomes necessary to protect citizens. The internal affairs supervisor's attorneys claimed they were scapegoats for systemic problems, but federal law holds officials accountable for the systems they operate. My clients were following established procedures, one attorney argued. They can't be blamed for systemic problems they inherited. Rodriguez responded by showing that the supervisors had actively created and maintained the corrupt procedures they claimed to be following. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Officer Douglas, guilty of assault on a federal agent and civil rights violations. Chief Brennan, guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights and obstruction of justice. Both internal affairs supervisors, guilty of systematic denial of civil rights under color of law. As the verdicts were read, Dr. Ramsey felt a sense of completion that transcended personal vindication. Douglas's assault had triggered a federal investigation that exposed institutional corruption and forced accountability at every level of the department. Judge Chen scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the real consequences were already evident. The Riverside Police Department would be placed under federal oversight, restructured according to constitutional requirements, and monitored to ensure compliance with civil rights law. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Ramsey addressed the media gathered to cover the historic convictions. Today's verdicts send a clear message, he said. Police officers who violate civil rights will face federal prosecution. Departments that enable misconduct will face federal oversight, and the institutional racism that led to my assault will face the full weight of federal law. A reporter asked about his unique role as both victim and expert witness. Officer Douglas thought he was pepper spraying some random troublemaker, Dr. Ramsey replied. Instead, he provided an FBI behavioral analyst with perfect evidence of how institutional racism operates. His prejudice became the case study that will help prevent future violations. Another reporter asked about the broader implications of the case. This case establishes that federal agents, regardless of race, have the full protection of the United States government. More importantly, it shows that institutional racism in policing can be exposed, prosecuted, and eliminated through federal civil rights enforcement. As Dr. Ramsey walked away from the courthouse, he reflected on the journey from victim to prosecutor. Douglas's assault had been personal, but the federal convictions were institutional. Individual accountability had been achieved, but systematic reform was just beginning. The amateur's prejudice had been defeated by the professional's expertise, one guilty verdict at a time. 6 months after Officer Chase Douglas pepper sprayed Dr. Blake Ramsey on a university campus, the transformation was complete. Douglas sat in federal prison, his police career destroyed by his own prejudice. Chief Brennan faced 5 years in federal custody for conspiracy to violate civil rights. The Riverside Police Department operated under comprehensive federal oversight, with every policy, procedure, and personnel decision subject to court-appointed monitors. But the most profound transformation had occurred in Dr. Blake Ramsey himself. The assault that had been intended to humiliate him had instead elevated him to become the nation's leading voice on police accountability. His research was now mandatory training in federal law enforcement agencies. His testimony had become the template for prosecuting institutional racism. His name was permanently attached to reforms that would protect countless citizens from experiencing what he had endured. Officer Douglas had pepper-sprayed what he thought was a troublemaker. Instead, he had created a champion of justice whose influence would reshape American policing for generations. The victim had become the victor, and the victory was transforming the entire system that had enabled his assault. Justice had been served, but transformation was eternal. The sentencing hearing for United States v. Douglas et al. Drew national media attention as Dr. Blake Ramsey prepared to deliver his victim impact statement. Federal Judge Margaret Chen had reviewed the extensive evidence of systematic civil rights violations and was prepared to impose sentences that would send a message to police departments across the country. Officer Chase Douglas sat at the defendant's table, no longer the confident authority figure who had assaulted a federal agent 6 months earlier. Federal prison had been harsh on a former police officer, and the psychological evaluation ordered by the court had revealed the depth of his racial prejudice. His attorney had argued for leniency based on Douglas's claimed remorse, but the evidence showed no genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Dr. Ramsey approached the podium to address the court, carrying with him not just personal trauma, but the collective pain of every citizen who had suffered under the department's corrupt practices. "Your Honor," Dr. Ramsey began, his voice steady and authoritative, "6 months ago, Officer Douglas pepper-sprayed me because his prejudice couldn't process the reality of a black man with expertise and authority. Today, I stand before this court as an FBI agent, university professor, and survivor of institutional racism that has finally been held accountable." Judge Chen listened intently as Dr. Ramsey continued, "My assault was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable result of a system that normalized bias, protected misconduct, and denied constitutional rights to minority citizens. Officer Douglas was not an aberration. He was the product of institutional corruption that this court has now exposed and condemned." Dr. Ramsey turned to face Douglas directly. "You saw my skin color and decided I didn't belong on a university campus. You refused to see my humanity, my credentials, or my constitutional rights. Your prejudice blinded you to everything except your need to assert dominance over someone you perceived as inferior." Douglas shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Dr. Ramsey's gaze. The psychological evaluation had documented his continued lack of empathy and resistance to acknowledging racial bias, making rehabilitation unlikely. "But Your Honor," Dr. Ramsey continued, "my purpose here today isn't just to document personal harm. It's to ensure that the systematic violations exposed by my assault lead to permanent change that protects others from experiencing what I endured." Dr. Ramsey outlined the broader impact of the case, describing how his assault had triggered the largest federal investigation of police bias in American history. 12 additional police departments were now under federal oversight. The Blake Ramsey Police Accountability Initiative had been implemented nationwide. Comprehensive bias training based on his research was now mandatory for all federal law enforcement agencies. "Officer Douglas thought he was putting me in my place," Dr. Ramsey concluded. "Instead, he elevated me to become a voice for police reform that will outlast his career, his department, and probably his lifetime. His prejudice has become the catalyst for protecting countless citizens from experiencing what he put me through." Judge Chen thanked Dr. Ramsey for his statement and proceeded to sentencing. "Officer Douglas, your assault on Dr. Ramsey was not just a crime against an individual. It was an attack on the constitutional principles that govern American law enforcement. Your systematic targeting of educated minorities demonstrates conscious bias that cannot be excused or minimized." She consulted the sentencing guidelines. "The court sentences you to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from employment in law enforcement and will undergo mandatory bias counseling throughout your supervision period." Douglas showed no emotion as the sentence was pronounced. Even facing 7 years in federal prison, He had not acknowledged the racial motivation behind his assault. Chief Brennan received 5 years in federal custody for his role in systematically protecting officers who violated civil rights. The internal affairs supervisors each received 3 years for conspiracy to deny constitutional rights. All would serve their sentences in federal facilities where their former status as law enforcement officials would make imprisonment particularly difficult. But the most significant consequence was the comprehensive federal oversight imposed on the Riverside Police Department. Judge Chen approved a consent decree that would fundamentally restructure how the department operated. This department will be placed under federal monitoring for a minimum of 5 years, Judge Chen announced. All policies, procedures, training programs, and personnel decisions will be subject to court-appointed oversight. The department will implement comprehensive bias training, civilian review boards, and independent investigation protocols for all complaints. The consent decree included specific requirements based on Dr. Ramsey's research and recommendations. Every officer would undergo psychological evaluation and bias assessment. Body cameras would be mandatory with tamper-proof technology. All uses of force would be independently investigated. Civilian oversight would have subpoena power and independent funding. The court finds that the Riverside Police Department engaged in systematic violations of constitutional rights. Judge Chen continued, "This consent decree will ensure that such violations never occur again under federal oversight." 3 months after sentencing, Dr. Blake Ramsey stood in the lecture hall at Georgetown University Law School, addressing an audience of federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement officials who had gathered for the inaugural Blake Ramsey Symposium on Police Accountability. "The assault I experienced was personal," Dr. Ramsey told the assembled audience. "But the solutions must be institutional. Individual accountability is necessary but insufficient. We must transform the systems that create officers like Chase Douglas." Attorney General Patricia Martinez, who had attended specifically to honor Dr. Ramsey's contributions to federal law enforcement, spoke about the broader impact of his case. Dr. Ramsey's assault opened the door to comprehensive police reform that has already prevented countless constitutional violations, Martinez said. The Blake Ramsey Police Accountability Initiative has been implemented in over 200 police departments, with measurable reductions in bias-motivated enforcement actions. The symposium featured panels on implicit bias training, civilian oversight models, and federal intervention strategies. Dr. Ramsey's research had become the foundation for evidence-based police reform that was being adopted nationwide. Dr. Amanda Foster, the civil rights attorney, who had been one of Douglas's earlier victims, spoke about the courage required to challenge institutional racism. Dr. Ramsey's willingness to speak out gave voice to all of us who had suffered in silence, Dr. Foster said. His expertise and federal credentials made it impossible for the system to dismiss or minimize what happened to him. His assault became our liberation. The symposium concluded with the announcement of permanent changes that would outlast any individual case or conviction. The FBI would establish bias monitoring units in all field offices. Federal funding for police departments would be contingent on compliance with civil rights standards. Civilian oversight would be required for all departments receiving federal grants. These reforms exist because Officer Douglas's prejudice was exposed, prosecuted, and punished, Dr. Ramsey observed during his closing remarks. His assault on me has become the foundation for protecting countless others from experiencing similar violations. 1 year after the assault, Dr. Blake Ramsey returned to the Riverside University campus, where Douglas had pepper sprayed him. The university had established the Blake Ramsey Center for Police Accountability Research, with Dr. Ramsey as its founding director. The center occupied a building directly across from the spot where the assault had occurred, a permanent reminder of how personal trauma had been transformed into institutional change. Students gathered for Dr. Ramsey's first lecture in the new center, eager to learn from someone who had experienced the bias he studied professionally. The classroom was packed with criminal justice majors, pre-law students, and graduate researchers in criminology. 1 year ago, I was pepper sprayed while walking across this campus to teach a class on police bias, Dr. Ramsey began. Today I'm teaching in a research center named after me, implementing reforms that will prevent others from experiencing what I endured. That transformation illustrates the power of turning personal injustice into systematic change. A student raised her hand. Dr. Ramsey, do you think Officer Douglas understood the consequences of his actions? Dr. Ramsey considered the question carefully. Douglas understood power as dominance over those he perceived as inferior. He didn't understand that real power comes from expertise, competence, and the ability to transform systems. His prejudice was his weakness, not his strength. Another student asked about the ongoing federal oversight of the police department. The Riverside Police Department is now a model for constitutional policing, Dr. Ramsey replied. Use of force incidents have dropped by 70%. Citizen complaints have decreased by 80%. Most importantly, community trust is being rebuilt through transparency and accountability. Dr. Ramsey walked to the window overlooking the quad where Douglas had assaulted him. That spot where I was pepper sprayed has become a symbol of transformation. Students stopped there to read the historical marker describing how personal courage can challenge institutional injustice. The historical marker, installed by the university, read, "On this site, Dr. Blake Ramsey, FBI Supervisory Special Agent and Professor of Criminal Psychology, was assaulted by Officer Chase Douglas for walking while black on a university campus. Dr. Ramsey's courage in confronting this injustice led to comprehensive police reforms that protect constitutional rights nationwide." A graduate student asked about Dr. Ramsey's current research focus. "I'm developing predictive models for identifying bias-prone officers before they commit constitutional violations," Dr. Ramsey explained. "My assault provided perfect case study material for understanding how prejudice operates in law enforcement settings. We're using that insight to prevent future violations, rather than just punish them after they occur." The research center had attracted federal funding, academic partnerships, and international attention. Dr. Ramsey's work was being studied by police reform advocates in Europe, Australia, and Canada. His assault had become a global case study in confronting institutional racism. The center receives requests from police departments seeking to implement our bias prevention programs. Dr. Ramsey continued, "Chiefs who once would have protected officers like Douglas are now asking us to help them identify and eliminate prejudice before it leads to constitutional violations." A law student asked about the psychological impact of being both victim and expert in the same case. Experiencing bias personally while possessing the expertise to analyze it professionally created unique insight, Dr. Ramsey replied. "I understood Douglas's psychology from the inside out, both as his target and as someone trained to profile criminal behavior. That dual perspective made my analysis more comprehensive than traditional victim testimony or expert analysis alone." Dr. Ramsey concluded the lecture by reading from the Supreme Court decision that had cited his case as precedent for federal intervention in local policing. In Ramsey v. Riverside Police Department, the court found that systematic protection of bias-motivated misconduct constitutes conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law. This decision establishes that institutional racism is not protected by local autonomy but subject to federal constitutional enforcement. The Supreme Court citation ensured that Dr. Ramsey's case would be studied in law schools, referenced in federal court decisions, and used to justify intervention in police departments across the country for decades to come. 2 years after the assault, Dr. Blake Ramsey received the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in Civil Rights Enforcement, the highest honor given to federal agents for protecting constitutional rights. The ceremony took place in the same Justice Department building where he had first reported Douglas's assault to his FBI colleagues. Attorney General Martinez presented the award before an audience of federal law enforcement officials, civil rights leaders, and reform advocates. Dr. Ramsey's courage in confronting institutional racism has transformed American policing, Martinez said. His expertise, combined with his personal experience, created unprecedented insight into how bias operates in law enforcement. The reforms implemented as a result of his case have prevented countless constitutional violations. Dr. Ramsey accepted the award on behalf of all victims of police bias whose voices had been silenced by institutional protection. This award represents every citizen who has suffered under biased policing, Dr. Ramsey said. Officer Douglas thought he was silencing one troublemaker. Instead, he amplified the voices of everyone who had been victimized by systematic prejudice. The ceremony included presentations on the measurable impact of the reforms Dr. Ramsey's case had generated. Excessive force incidents involving minorities had decreased by 60% in departments implementing his bias prevention programs. Citizen complaints alleging racial profiling had dropped by 70% in areas with federal oversight. Most significantly, community trust in law enforcement was being rebuilt through transparency and accountability. FBI Director Morrison spoke about the institutional changes within federal law enforcement. Dr. Ramsey's research has become mandatory training for all FBI agents, Morrison announced. His assault provided us with perfect insight into how bias can blind law enforcement to obvious realities. We've used that insight to ensure federal agents are trained to recognize and overcome prejudicial assumptions. The Justice Department had established the Blake Ramsey Fellowship Program, providing funding for researchers studying police bias and accountability. Fellows would work with Dr. Ramsey's center to develop evidence-based reforms that could be implemented nationwide. These fellowships ensure that the work begun by Dr. Ramsey's case will continue indefinitely, Martinez explained. Each new researcher builds on his foundation, expanding our understanding of how to prevent bias-motivated violations. Dr. Ramsey used his acceptance speech to look toward the future of police reform. Officer Douglas's assault on me was meant to enforce racial hierarchy through violence, Dr. Ramsey said. Instead, it has created a legacy of accountability that will protect constitutional rights for generations. His prejudice has become the foundation for justice. 5 years after the assault, Dr. Blake Ramsey published The Douglas Effect: How Personal Injustice Becomes Institutional Change, a comprehensive analysis of how his case had transformed American policing. The book became required reading in criminal justice programs nationwide and was translated into 12 languages for international study. The book's introduction captured the transformation that had occurred. Officer Chase Douglas pepper-sprayed me because his prejudice couldn't process the reality of a black man with authority and expertise. He saw my race and decided I didn't belong on a university campus. 5 years later, my research center operates from that same campus, training police departments worldwide in constitutional accountability. Douglas's prejudice has become the catalyst for protecting countless citizens from experiencing what he put me through. The book documented measurable changes in American policing: 45% reduction in excessive force cases involving minorities, 60% decrease in racial profiling complaints, and 80% improvement in community trust surveys. Police departments that had once operated with impunity now submitted to federal oversight and civilian review. The Douglas Effect demonstrates that institutional racism can be exposed, prosecuted, and eliminated through comprehensive federal intervention, Dr. Ramsey wrote. One officer's assault on one federal agent triggered changes that have protected millions of citizens from constitutional violations. The book's final chapter looked toward future challenges and opportunities. Chase Douglas is scheduled for release from federal prison next year. Dr. Ramsey noted, he will emerge into a world where the policing practices he represented have been largely eliminated. The reforms his assault triggered will outlast his career, his department, and probably his lifetime. Dr. Ramsey had been contacted by Douglas's attorney about a possible meeting, but declined. I have no interest in personal reconciliation with someone who has never acknowledged the racial motivation behind his assault, Dr. Ramsey explained. My focus remains on systematic change that prevents future violations. On the 5th anniversary of the assault, Dr. Blake Ramsey stood before the historical marker on the Riverside University campus, surrounded by students, faculty, and civil rights leaders who had gathered to commemorate the transformation that had begun with his pepper spraying. 5 years ago, Officer Douglas pepper sprayed me on this spot because his prejudice couldn't allow him to see me as a human being deserving constitutional protection, Dr. Ramsey told the assembled crowd. Today, this site represents the power of turning personal trauma into institutional change. University President Sarah Chen spoke about the global impact of Dr. Ramsey's work. The Blake Ramsey Center for Police Accountability Research has become the world's leading institution for studying and preventing bias in law enforcement, President Chen announced. Students from 6 continents come here to learn from Dr. Ramsey's experience and expertise. The anniversary celebration included the dedication of a new monument recognizing all victims of police bias who had found justice through Dr. Ramsey's case. The monument listed the names of the 28 plaintiffs who had joined the class action lawsuit, each representing systematic violations that had been exposed by federal investigation. These names represent every citizen whose constitutional rights were violated by institutional racism, Dr. Ramsey said as he unveiled the monument. Their courage in coming forward transformed my personal assault into comprehensive accountability. Dr. Amanda Foster, now a federal judge appointed partly due to her advocacy work following Dr. Ramsey's case, spoke about the ongoing importance of confronting bias. Dr. Ramsey's assault could have been just another dismissed complaint, another covered-up incident, another victory for institutional racism, Judge Foster observed. Instead, his expertise and courage created a legacy of accountability that will protect constitutional rights indefinitely. The ceremony concluded with the announcement of permanent endowments that would fund police accountability research in perpetuity. Dr. Ramsey's work had attracted sufficient private and federal funding to ensure the center would operate indefinitely, continuing to develop reforms that prevented bias-motivated violations. Officer Douglas thought he was ending a conversation about police accountability. Dr. Ramsey concluded. Instead, he started a movement that will never end. His prejudice has become the foundation for justice that will outlast us all. As the crowd dispersed, Dr. Ramsey remained at the site of his assault, reflecting on the journey from victim to reformer. Douglas's pepper spray had burned his eyes for hours, but the changes it triggered would protect constitutional rights forever. 5 years earlier, he had been pepper sprayed for walking while black on a university campus. Now he was the nation's leading voice on police accountability. His research was mandatory training in federal agencies, and his name was permanently attached to reforms that had transformed American policing. Officer Chase Douglas had pepper sprayed what he thought was a troublemaker. Instead, he had created a champion of justice whose influence would reshape law enforcement for generations. The victim had become the victor, and the victory was eternal. Have you ever seen someone's prejudice become the very foundation for the justice they tried to prevent? When expertise meets injustice, the results can transform entire systems. Dr. Ramsey's assault wasn't just a crime. It was the beginning of a revolution in police accountability that continues to protect constitutional rights today. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that expertise and courage can overcome institutional prejudice, then share it. Help us continue telling stories that document both the persistence of bias and the possibility of transformation. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability reach people who need to see that change is possible, that dignity under pressure can create lasting progress. Like this video if you believe that professional competence should triumph over amateur prejudice. Subscribe to Color of Justice for more stories that show how individual courage can challenge institutional corruption. Comment below about your own experiences with bias and accountability, because these conversations matter, these stories matter, and your voice matters. Thank you for following this journey from assault to accountability, from victim to victor, from personal trauma to institutional transformation. This is how justice works, not through violence or dominance, but through expertise, courage, and the determination to turn personal injustice into systematic change.